So everybody take that deep breath into your spirit. Because when we're talking about FASD, really it's really about trying to be up here and figure things out. But I am an Indigenous woman. I am a Métis woman as well, which means I'm connected to a lot of European history, which is the way a lot of Indigenous people are. And let me just say something. I work in two worlds. So I have an English grandmother and I have a Cree grandmother, and that was how I learned how to live in this world. And knowing my English grandmother, who was very superstitious and had all kinds of interesting earth-based teachings, and knowing my Cree grandmother, who's also very superstitious and had a lot of earth-based teachings, what I discovered very early on is that really we're not any different than anyone else. So it's not about people being off on their own and different. It's really about all of us together, working together with our unique gifts. So we're all Indigenous people. Let me just say that. So what that means essentially is that all of us come from Indigenous roots. So some people might be 900 years removed from their initial Indigenous roots. And all of us were raised with earth-based teachings way, way back, depending on where we came from. So we have this wonderful understanding of epigenetics, which is the science of how we figure out why behaviors get passed down from one generation to another. And epigenetics is a way of describing intergenerational trauma. And so all of us carry the memories and the behaviors of our ancestors. That's how we're made up. So, and it's not just genetic, it's environment. We know that within epigenetics that the environment we live in has a great deal to do with how we behave and how we see the world and how we learn. And that's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit today. So I was raised very culturally by my little Cree grandmother. I really learned how to live on the land. And I learned all about medicines, and I learned all about spirit. And had I not learned that from my grandmother, that grandmother, I don't know how I would have survived in this world, because I was diagnosed as mentally retarded, which they don't even use that term anymore. I was not a good student. I didn't understand the way things were taught when I went to school, because they didn't have different learning styles back then. You either fit into this or you didn't fit. And I was also diagnosed with other mental health issues. The reality of it is I'm not mentally retarded. I graduated from university with a 3.98 average, so I mean that I said thank you, you know. It made me work harder, I think, to prove that I wasn't stupid, because there's something about labeling kids that you believe. So I know I'm not stupid. I don't know lots of things, but I know enough about who I am and how to get around in the world, and I can only teach what I know. And so that's where we all get connected, right? Is that we are all equal. We all have gifts. And there isn't any such thing as differences within the Indigenous world. We don't even use that term in my language. So they are gifts. So it's just that we all come from an Indigenous perspective, because we all come from earth-based teaching. So your ancestors would have passed down that understanding of the earth to you. And that's why when we begin to talk about earth-based teachings, a lot of people go, oh, that makes so much sense to me. That's because you already know it. It's there. So it's interesting for me to hear things about mindfulness. It's interesting for me to hear things about yoga and our, you know, those are all very earth-based teachings. They're very ancient, coming from a cultural understanding. So within the Indigenous worldview, we don't call it mindfulness, because there's this wonderful thing called evidence-based research, right? To Indigenous people, we are very scientific people. The way we figured out how to live our life was through observation and experience, right? So, you know, like if you've ever hunted a moose during mating season, when you shoot a bull moose in the proper way, right, offering that tobacco, whatever, when you go to skin him and open him up, his liver is all white and deformed. Okay? And you think, wow, some people would say that moose is sick, right? But the reality of it is that bull moose, what's he been doing, right? He's been chasing after the females. And he's so intent on that he doesn't pee, he doesn't do anything, right? He holds on to everything. There she is. And so what happens when you don't pee is that lots of things happen to your insides, right? So we know, so what our elders would do is they watch that moose and see what he eats when mating season is over. So usually you wouldn't hunt a moose during mating season necessarily, you'd wait till after, right? And the plants that he's eating, what happens then is he heals himself by eating those right plants, right? So when you shoot him, you know, several months later, his liver's okay, and you go, right? So Indigenous people, and remember I'm talking about all of us as Indigenous people, because our ancestors, whether we're Indigenous in this generation or not, all had to learn those things. Because we didn't have telephones, we didn't have X-ray machines, we didn't have any of those things. We had to learn from what was going on around us. We had to learn how to heal. We had to learn to have respect for everything around us. And we recognized as Indigenous people, and whenever I use that term, I want you to remember, I'm talking about all of us, okay? We had to learn as Indigenous people how to survive in all kinds of challenges. What did we do, you know, in droughts? What plants did we look for where that water would have been carried deep down, right? What animals, you know, would we hunt in certain seasons? What berries would we eat? So the tea that I brought you today, and it's not tea that has a lot of things in it, but we know, for example, that mint, which I have, which I picked, Labrador tea, which is how the Cree and Ojibwe women kept the Hudson's Bay Company people alive during the winter because it carries so much vitamin C. That's picked here in Saskatchewan. There's another tea there that has all kinds of things in it, including juniper berries, which I get in the mountains, which are all really good for colds. So that medicine, a lot of today's medicine it all comes from the earth, right? And a lot of those people that were trying to figure out what do I use to cure cancer and what do I do to do this, all came from the earth, and they would talk to elders and they would observe those things, right? So, and I say this because I smile when people say, what's the evidence, Kerrie, when I'm talking about vibration, because I'm very much about vibration. What do I feel? And so I don't think very well because I'm mentally retarded, remember that, so. And I do hear voices, but don't tell anybody. So when you come from an Indigenous based culture, it's very much about what we feel, not about what we think. So if you ask, for example, an Indigenous child, what do you think? And if they're coming from trauma and all of those things that are associated with trauma, including FASD, they'll go. But if you say to them, what do you feel about that? They'll tell you these rich stories, right? So people who have trauma, and of course, when we're looking at FASD, we're looking at all of the effects of trauma, right? FASD being one of them, right? Really is coming from that environment. We know that not only genetics determines how we grow and how our brain grows. It's the environment too. So if you grow up in an environment where there's lots of neglect and abuse, then what happens is you get stuck in the midbrain, right here. Right all inside here. And the midbrain is all about fight, flee, or freeze. That's all you know. And if you don't resolve the trauma that you've experienced, that's the way you're going to be forever. And the good thing to know is that trauma is treatable. So there are things that work for trauma, and there are things that work for FASD, because guess what? FASD is in the brain. And if you're connected to spirit, then you're going to get the answer. And I'm going to do a little exercise with you before we finish. And to some of you, I might have done that last year a little bit. But so what we're really looking at is how do we help people with trauma? That's the basis. The effect of trauma, of FASD is trauma, right? It's just an effect of that. So trauma is the underlying issue often with people that have FASD. It's where they're coming from, right? What's happened? What's happened? So FASD is just one of those things of what's happened, not what's wrong with you, right? I mean, we don't use those terms, right? And so we know that when people have FASD, they develop other coping mechanisms somehow in their life, right? Just like somebody who is born blind, for example, they have intense feelings of intuition. So their other senses develop very quickly in order to overcompensate for what else is going on that isn't working quite well. And we all know, if you're working with FASD, and you all do, that we see miracles every day, right? I worked with a young girl for 10 years. Not the whole 10 years, but I was her therapist. And she was in this wonderful home for 10 years. And that mom, just consistent, loving, no matter what was going on in her life. And of course, impulsivity is one of the big things, right? And so she was always getting into trouble. And she knew it after the fact, right? But she was always getting into trouble. So one day, when she was 18, I hadn't heard from her for a while, and she came, and I was trying to give her little tools to remind her about different things. And we're trying to give her as much love and compassion, consistency, repetition, all of the things that we do, right? And one day she called me and she said, "Kerrie, I haven't seen you for so long." And I said, "How are you doing?" She said, "I just wanted to tell you that something happened." And I said, "What?" Thinking she was going to tell me something bad. And she said, "Well, you know how we always talk about consequences and how I don't seem to know that until after?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I kept doing what you asked. I tried to write down things to remind me. I tried to really connect to my culture. I'm drumming every day. I'm smudging every day." And she said, "Yesterday, I got asked to go to a party. I knew it was not right." And she said, "Usually I would say yes." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "I said no." "Kerrie, is that possible?" And that young girl is at university now. So we know that there are certain things that work. That might take a while, though. It takes that same consistency before you start to see the brain change, right? I mean, we know that the brain can change. We know. We know that the brain only knows what the brain knows until we give it something new to learn, right? So it is possible to change your brain in any situation. We're not sure how long it takes, but there are things that are much quicker. And one of them is culture. Now let me tell you about that and why I know about that, okay? So one of the wonderful places that I'm an elder at is called the Nitsa Learning Center in Calgary. Nitsa Tepee Learning Center just began last year, so I couldn't take anybody for a tour. It only opened in January. It's been in operation for a year now. And that school is just for Indigenous children, 2.8 to 8. Works very much around the models that we work with, right? And but they add different things because now they're teaching curriculum and language and all those kinds of things within the school. So they paid, I don't know how much money to develop this school. It's the only school of its kind in North America. And those children came from another school before they came into the new school. And when they were in the mainstream school, where Head Start was located in the school, as well as grade 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, they had, a lot of the children within that group were on the FASD spectrum. And often, because they were so little, they had to have assistance because, you know, they couldn't do more than one task at a time. It's so difficult to order our brain, do this first, and then come in and do this, and take your coat off and sit in a circle. All of those things that we were teaching children at the very beginning. And that's what I saw at the other school. And we use cards to guide them and things that we do, a lot of the techniques that we use. When those children, we did a ceremony, moving camp ceremony, where the children got to choose their sacred objects. And they brought them with them. And we walked, that's how close we were, from that school to the new school. And did ceremony in the school. And the teachers were all trained in compassion therapy, even the janitor. And they have a family room when you walk in. They have food for the family. It's just the quietest, most beautiful. As the children come in off the bus every day, they have the morning song being sung. It's the Blackfoot morning song. And they walk through smudge. They smudge, right? Now here's these little children coming from another school that when they came off their bus, they could remember to get off their bus, but after that, who knows what happened? In 3 months, those little children, the same ones, get off the bus, take their boots off, walk in single file to their classrooms, put their things away, sit on the rug in a circle. 3 months. So what's so special about this place? Culture. So they still have to teach curriculum, right? So a lot of the teachers said, okay, Kerrie, we're smudging every day. We have a dancer who comes in and teaches the children dance. And they do beadwork, they do all of these things. But within that cultural piece, they're teaching numeracy skills. They're teaching language skills because they're singing the songs. Because a lot of those children may have come from a place where they didn't have that adult who was really there to protect them and help them and nurture them, right? They were left on their own. So they didn't develop their language skills because nobody ever sang to them or talked to them. So, I mean, the first piece we do when we're talking to babies, and I have grandbabies, so I go, oh, I talk baby talk, right? And my son is a doctor, and he said, don't talk baby talk, Mom. Talk to her in language. And I said to him, you should know, because my son went to ceremony with me. I said, how do we sing? How do we talk? We go, yeah, right? We're using vowels when we're singing our songs. We know that children need to hear vowels when they're very young in order for, by the time they're 5, the language part of their brain starts to click on really well. But they have to hear the vowels to know how to formulate the words. That's why we sing our songs with vowels. The vowels also vibrate the body in a different way. So we know that if we're really stuck in our head and we're trying to figure things out, because everything that we do is all about what do we think and how do we look, rather than who are you and how are you connected. Right? All of us, not just Indigenous people here in this generation, If you've been colonized, and we all have, some people have been colonized many times, what happens? First thing that happens is they take the children, disconnect them from their cultural roots. Can't drum anymore, can't do ceremony anymore, right? You're gonna learn this language, you're gonna go this way, right? If we don't connect to spirit, then what happens is, for the rest of our life, unless somebody tells us different, we will look outside of ourselves for the answers. Everybody that's been colonized, that's what happens, right? As children, we just want so badly to learn, right? We're going to listen to the people. That's that one adult, perhaps, in our lives that nurtures us and guides us, right? When we're taken away from our families that way, right? The second piece is, if you're not connected for whatever reason, we have to go to the emotional piece of us to heal. Well, you know, I hear about mindfulness over there, I hear about yoga. What does that do? What that does is it tends to relax the brain, put it into a resting state so that you come down into your spirit. So what we're doing is not mindfulness, it's actually spiritfulness. It has nothing to do with the mind. We're resting the brain, coming into the mid-body. So Indigenous people have called it spiritfulness since the beginning of time. That's what we do. We don't do mindfulness. It has nothing to do with the mind. It's about resting, coming down here. So your brain has to be at a resting state, whether you have FASD, whether you have trauma, whether you have any other organic brain disorders, whatever it might be. You have to be at a resting state before you can learn. Because if you have trauma, you're stuck in your midbrain and you can't move into the prefrontal cortex, which is how we solve problems. That's where you learn numeracy. That's where you learn to read. So what happens to people who've had trauma with all of the effects around it, right? Addiction sometimes, FASD, maybe there's violence in your family, other mental health issues, because we often have co-occurring disorders, comorbidity, whatever that might be, right? All because of trauma. That's the root issue of all of this. We have to work with the trauma. And that's why I'm telling you this, because if we don't know about how to do this, how can we just start programs, right? We have to recognize that if people have FASD, whether they're living in an environment where there's no trauma right now, they have come from trauma. And so their brain functions in a different way. But it doesn't mean we can't help them learn. We just have to get out of the colonized perspective that everybody needs to be in their brain. That's a colonized perspective. All of us have been colonized. It's not about what we think. It's about who are we. And if you have that taken away, then you're going to think somebody else has all the answers. So colonization creates two-dimensional people. What we think and what we look like. In an Indigenous worldview, we're all Indigenous. How was it before we were colonized? Who are you? You're loving, you're beautiful. Let me raise you in a way where you're loved and you're connected to the earth. You know that ceremonies are your way to heal. You know what medicines to eat, right? You know how to live your life. What happens when you're connected to spirit is that you grow up being accountable and responsible. If you're not, this one?
I believe so. Try one side or the other.
The other one? Oh, okay. So that's what I've been talking about, the midbrain. That's where we are when we're in trauma. We cannot get to the executive functioning skills until we heal the midbrain. And that's what you're doing essentially. Because when kids have FASD, they're stuck in the midbrain too. because it must be so confusing for them. They're in danger all the time. Oh, what do I do this? And they're constantly worried about, what do people think? I don't know if I can do that. I have anxiety, I have anger, I have depression. So kids with FASD are no different from anybody else in trauma, right? They carry all of the fear around, what will people think, or I don't trust myself, or all of those kinds of things. So we know that when people have trauma, the three things that come up most are anger, anxiety, and depression. Now, my grandmother used to say, those are the three sisters. I don't know why we name those things after women, right? But that will come up when you're not paying attention to what you need to pay attention to, because those are all about not being in control. Those three things. So I can't tell you how many people come to me and say, I have clinical depression. And when I work with them, I realize they don't have clinical depression at all. Yes, their mother was depressed, their grandmother was depressed, their auntie is depressed. Why? When I look at their environment, I see the trauma that they're experiencing. And I say, you don't have clinical depression. You have situational depression or environmental depression. So let's change what's happening in your environment. Guess what happens? The depression goes away. So anger is about trying to give somebody else your pain. Right? I have all this pain and I just want you to feel as bad as I do. Right? Anxiety is about, I don't trust anybody else around me. I can't go on the LRT, I can't take that bus, I can't get out of my house today because what if that man is there, right? So anxiety is about not having control over anybody else. Well, guess what? We don't, right? But how does a child know that, right? Because I'm talking about childhood behaviors here. And then, of course, depression comes from, life is so bad for me, I just can't seem to get ahead. I'm just going to stay at home because here I'm safe, out there I'm not. So all of those three things, anger, anxiety, and depression, are really about not being in control. And that's what comes up when you have trauma. And all of us have had trauma. Maybe not intergenerational trauma anymore, but all of us come from trauma. We all go through those things, right? So I'm a psychotherapist. Yes, I am a psychotherapist. And I work from spirit first. Let's get you connected to who you are. So I love that exercise today because it's really about who are you. And I teach at the university, and the very first thing I do is, who are you? People tell me things, right? And I say to them, your final project isn't to tell me about FASD or what you do in your program or what you're going to do. Your final project is to tell me who you are, how you're connected to your spirit. What have you dealt with in your emotions? Because those are the most important things for human beings. We're four-dimensional: spiritual, emotional, physical, and mental. So colonization takes the bottom two. They say the bottom two. They're actually the top two, because we have to start with spirit or we have no connection. However you do it, right? Doesn't matter. And we have to honor our emotions. Creator gave us all these emotions. We have a huge gamut of emotions. And those emotions are to heal us. What happens in colonization? Don't talk about it. Don't say anything. Suck it up. All Creator wants is for you to say, I have a right to feel guilty. We have to acknowledge our emotions to heal our spirit. So when you think about how we live, right? How is the world around us, right? Everything is about, what do you think? What do you look like? Those things don't matter. What really matters is, who are you? How do you connect? How do you feel? And then you can look at physically, how do I live in the world, right? Because now you can solve problems, right? You have to heal trauma, which includes FASD. You can't heal it completely, but you can certainly get people in a different place. Whenever you're working with people, you have to have them down here. And if you're psychologists here amongst us, you know that the very first thing you do is grounding. Where does the word grounding come from? Earth, right? We ground them however we do that. With music, right? With spiritfulness, with drumming, all of those things. So let me just explain how we do that now from a perspective. When we talk about who are Indigenous people, this is all of us. I keep saying that because I want you to I'm not talking about people who aren't us. We're all Indigenous people. We come from Indigenous roots somewhere. How do you create a healthy, successful individual? This is how we would have done it. So when you go back to your roots, if you have strong kinship ties, so you have that family that's loving and nurturing to you, keep you safe, we know that one caring adult in your life determines whether you're going to be able to get beyond your trauma or not. One caring adult, that's all it takes. Sometimes the only caring adult you have is the first teacher you meet, right? Or maybe somebody in Head Start that you just connect to because you feel whatever he or she is doing, they live that experience. So what children with trauma experience is somebody saying, oh, you're so this, you're so that, and then they do something to you that's not very nice. And so children grow up believing that they can't trust anybody. And boy, do they ever have a hard time with that, because they'll try and sabotage every relationship, including work, anything, because they don't believe you. Yes, I do love you. Nobody else has loved me. Every time everybody's told me they loved me, they did something. Pushed me away, right? So what happens is, within school systems, within Head Start programs, within any system at all, you start to see behaviors of children just totally. Because they don't believe what they see. They keep thinking somebody is going to do something to them or leave them. So they're going to do it to you. They're going to push you. So that eventually you're going to say, I have to send you to another school. That's what they're waiting for. That's what they're used to. Because everybody's rejected them. They're not bad. They have trauma. And boy, is that hard when they get to that point, because they're trying to sabotage their environment. So even if you live in hell, if that's all you know, you're going to want everybody to be in hell, right? So that's why you can get kids to a certain point and they're sitting in a circle and they're quite happy, and all of a sudden that child starts to act up after a while, right? And so people say, I don't know what happened. Well, what's happened is that child feels very uncomfortable in a safe environment, because that's not their environment, right? So you get lots of behaviors from children who don't believe what you're showing them, because that's not their experience. That's when it's tough, because what do you do with those kids, right? What we do is culture. When a child is overwhelmed, we smudge them. And the most amazing thing happens. They still their brain, and they come down into their spirit, and then I can talk to them. So, what's going on today? So let's figure out how to work in this way, right? So we all come from that place of nurturing, love and kindness, at least one adult in your life that is going to keep you safe. So even if you do have trauma in your life, you have one person in your life that can kind of get you away, right? That was my grandmother in my life. No matter what was going on around me, my grandma would go, come, right? She'd take me. We'd go out in the bush. That was her way of getting me away from anything. Even when the snow's deep, we'd be hiking through the snow, right? And I'd say, Grandma, I'm tired. No, no. Come on, right? By the time I got to the end, I forgot all about what was happening behind me, right? So if you have that, you develop secure attachment. So trauma is actually 3 things: grief, attachment disorder, and all of the things that come with trauma. That's what intergenerational trauma is, okay? So if you have all of that from 0 to 3, as you see, that's when the most influential time is for a child, is between 0 and 3. That's why we invest so much into early childhood development, right? If you have that little child will grow up with a sense of worth. They will have trust. They will trust people. They'll start to be able to have social interactions with people and figure out how to work with them. They'll have pride in who they are because they're connected, right? And they'll have emotional regulation. Well, they'll have emotional regulation of a 4 and 5-year-old, right? Which is still up and down, but they're going to learn it as they go along. And if they have that, then as an adolescent, which is the most difficult time when you get to adolescence, if you haven't intervened before that point, because now all the other hormones are surging through their body, they're impulsive, and the reward center is going bing, 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 right? So a lot of the things that you've done before that time, you start to see go offline at that point, right? And if you have all of those things, that adolescent will have the accountability and responsibility. Well, you might get into trouble, but you're not going to probably keep getting into trouble. You know what I mean? Like, you have a free will, which means you're going to make decisions that are based on what's right for you, not necessarily what's based on the right of other people. This is when kids get really involved with gangs. And you will have executive functioning skills. You'll be able to actually have cognitive functioning where you're flexible in your brain. You're able to go from one thing to another thing and come back to other things. You'll have a memory. Remember to go back to all of those memory things. You'll have a certain amount of social intelligence, as they call it, emotional intelligence. And if you have that, you're going to grow up to be an adult with a strong self-concept, which is really about how do I see myself in my roles, how do other people see me, and how do I fit into that? A strong cultural identity, which is integral. Independence, huge, right? A lot of adults that I meet that have FASD and trauma, because I use you can use them interchangeably, but I've never met anybody that has FASD that didn't have trauma too. I don't know about you. If you do, that's amazing, but I haven't. And so what happens is the fact that that people that have a healthy life have independence, but people that come from anything in their life that's a challenge where it's unresolved are very dependent. And certainly people are different, so they're unique, so they will have different independence depending on where they're at, right? But everybody has the opportunity to be independent to a certain degree. I work with children sometimes that are high on the spectrum, and I work with people that are low on the spectrum. And I can honestly tell you that in ceremony, you don't know the difference. I have Escapios, helpers, that help light the fire and bring the fire in, my women and my men. It's a routine, right? I teach them in the very beginning, this is what you need to do first, this is what you need to do next. And I'm prepared to keep telling them that, but something happens when you're doing ceremony. I don't have to tell them after the first time. That's how amazing it is. They're like, oh, okay, no, and if somebody makes a mistake, oh my heavens, they'll let you know, right? No, you put that wood there first, right? And I go, wow. Because doing ceremony brings people down into their spirit. It rests their brain so they don't have to think with their brain. they feel with their spirit, because your body and your head are attached. So what's going on in your brain also affects you in your body. We know that. So we often have lots of issues when life isn't working for us in a good way. We can have stomach aches and headaches and all of those kinds of things. And in fact, as a psychotherapist, when people come to see me, they don't say, I'm having issues with my daughter or whatever. They say to me, Kerrie, I have this headache. That's the first thing they say to me. And I'll say, well, let's talk about that, right? Because we know that your body will carry certain emotions. A headache is an emotion, unless there's another reason for it. I mean, there's always reasons why we have disease and sickness, but if you have a headache and nobody can figure it out. So when you don't deal with your emotions by saying thank you to your emotions, so you can let them go, because our emotions are creators' antibiotics. All you have to do is say thank you. It's like taking that pill, right? I had pneumonia and had to take major antibiotics, and I was like, I don't want to take these things, but I did, and within 48 hours I started to feel better. And that's how our emotions are. You have to say thank you. I have a right to feel guilt or shame or any of those kinds of things, right? Because as soon as you acknowledge it, you start to heal it. So you have to feel in order to heal. So what happens to us in colonization is, we've all been colonized too, remember that? We're all colonized people, all of us. We're all indigenous people. What happens to us is that those feelings, we're not allowed to express them. Oh my heavens, don't tell somebody that, right? Keep it to yourself, right? So we become very disconnected from our body. We're trying to think so hard about how to do things, right? We're really disconnected from our body. And if we're going to work with people who have trauma and FASD or anything else, we have to realize that we have to work spiritually, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a wonderful therapy if you can think. It's the last thing I do. I do experiential therapies. Ceremony is experiential therapy. When we were smudging, that's therapy, right? Very emotional. So in order to change your brain, you have to have an emotional connection to something. So when you have an aha moment, as Bev was talking about, that's a chemical reaction. So chemicals are released when you go, that makes so much sense to me. You have to have a chemical, you have to have an emotional response to get your brain to change. So when I say, you need to do this to my children, you have to do this. They don't hear it. You can't tell people how to live their lives, you have to show them. They have to experience it. They have to experience it. When you're doing yoga, my heavens, you're so connected, right? It's like you're moving and you're breathing, right? That's why they do yoga in school a lot now. Because if you're carrying trauma, I feel, right? You have to have a release, right? We tell kids to stretch, we tell them to run, we tell them to do. So actually, when you are a bully and you're carrying a lot of anger, that's your release, right? That's where bullies are made. They're people that have so much trauma, they just want to give the pain to somebody else. So, I don't have very much time left. I'm going the wrong way now. So you might not use the ACE scores, or some of you might. I've used them for 12 years now. The ACE scores are the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale that is very rigorous research that was done in the States. And they asked people who were not Indigenous, they asked people basically who had health care in the States, these 10 questions. Have you ever had physical abuse, emotion, all of those things. There's 10 questions. And they realized that the more of those scores that you said yes to, the more adverse your health will be for the rest of your life. It might shorten your life by 20 years. And part of you, and the stress that you've experienced because of those cause things like diabetes, arthritis, cancer. Those are the three major things that we get when we've been under stress all our lives. Okay? That's not the only reason we get those, but we know that that is a great predictor of what will happen health-wise when we're under so much stress, right? And we also know there are all kinds of other things that happen to us. One is there's way more addictions in our lives when we have at least 4 of these. So we know if you have 4 of these, if you answer 4 to these, you have trauma. So when I do this, so I took a cross-section of 100 of my clients for 12 years because I use this. It's a very easy way to determine if you have trauma. And what I found was that out of 100 people, all 100 of those people of that cross-section had at least 4 of these. And they were all Indigenous. Okay, so this was not done on Indigenous people, right? This was done in the States on people who probably were middle-class people that had health care, right? So we know that when you take this ACE score, and you ask these questions of somebody over 18, by the way. So you don't ask children this, right? So they would ask an adult, when you were under 18, did any of these happen, right? So a lot of the, in Alberta, a lot of the Alberta Health Services are using this as soon as you come in the door. They want to know, what are your outcomes going to be if you have X amount of these, which I don't particularly agree with because it's labeling us to some degree, right? But so I never tell people if my clients have this, but they are using it now because it is such a predictor of what your life will be like. So more addictions, more domestic violence, more people who live in poverty because they can't keep a job because they have no relationship base, right? Like that goes with work too. All of a sudden, I can't go to that workplace because there's somebody in there and I don't like the way she looks at me and she makes me uncomfortable. And you might not know all of these things, right? So lots of outcomes, lots of health outcomes, lots of relationship issues, lots of suicide, all kinds of things happen if you have 4 or more of these. Okay? So out of 100, I had 78 that had 10 out of 10. I have 9. So luckily, I had help in my life. That's why I didn't go to school till I was 50. I had to figure myself out. How could I work with people if I was so full of turmoil, right? So, yes?
I just wondering, you said you have to have 4 more to experience trauma, but I can see like just one of these being extremely traumatic. So what do you mean by, do you mean like physical, like you receive trauma in the brain?
Yeah, so what we know is that the definition of trauma and the behaviors that are associated with that, that's how we determine whether you have trauma. You could develop stress or toxic stress because of any of these, right? Yeah. But if you have trauma, it means you have long-term behaviors or things that are going on, okay? So there is a definition for trauma, right? So, and you can find this all over the website. So just go under ACE scores and they pop up all over the place for you to look at. You would never ask these questions of children. You might get somebody else to do this, but it's a very traumatizing thing because people look at it and they go, wow, I had no idea I had all of these things in my life. But it's the good thing to know is that trauma is treatable. Trauma is treatable. Can you eliminate trauma? Yeah. If you are diagnosed, and that's the other piece, a lot of Indigenous people are highly misdiagnosed because trauma was never recognized in the DSM manual before the last few years as a disorder. It was kind of under the anxiety framework, right? Now, it's in the DSM-5 manual, which is how we diagnose people, as a complex trauma. They have different definitions for it. So more people are using trauma inventories rather than personality inventories, which is a good thing because I know children that are apprehended because their mom is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, right? Borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, clinical depression. A lot of those things are directly related to trauma. So you deal with the trauma, get into the midbrain, do the emotional healing. Guess what happens? The depression goes away. The behaviors go away. And that's why we know they have trauma. Because if you're diagnosed with a personality disorder, you will always have that personality disorder. You can certainly take medication for it to stabilize you, but you will have it always. I see people that are highly misdiagnosed that get better when they're working in ceremony or doing experiential therapy. All of a sudden their symptoms go away. Eating disorders, right? I work with an eating disorder clinic now because something happened. I had one Indigenous woman that came to me, and she's now a psychologist, and she'd had an eating disorder all her life because of all of the abuse that was going on in her life. And she was diagnosed with FASD, by the way. And so how does she take control? Eating disorders are about controlling that, right? You want to control something in your life, so that's what eating disorders are. And so she came to ceremony for the first time. She's from Saskatchewan. She lives in Alberta now. Never raised in her culture because of adoption. She came to a ceremony with me. And in that ceremony, she came to me afterwards and she said, I just learned so much about myself. I figured so many things out. It changed my life. She went back to her psychiatrist because she's in a group of women that have eating disorders. And she explained to the psychiatrist about how she didn't have that eating disorder now for 2 months at least. And of course, that's not an indicator that you might not have an eating disorder, right? That's just part of it. And she told the psychiatrist what happened, and he said, wow, can I talk to that woman? So he talked to me, and I came back into that group of 12 women. Some of them had been there for 9 years in that circle. And I did ceremony. We drummed. I sang, yeah, you. Because that's, right. What does drumming do, right? Every single culture has a drum. Why? Because they're Indigenous people. So what does a drum do? Balancing left, right brain. So EMDR, those things that you talk about, right? That is the Indigenous way of EMDR. Because that vibration, if you're playing a drum, it vibrates right through your body. And what it does is it vibrates the pain out of you. Because we know that trauma isn't just in our head, it's in our body, right? So I'm a body psychotherapist as well. I'm not just a clinical social worker. I'm also a body therapist because I realize that there comes to a certain point where people get to a point where they're like, okay, I get it, but I still feel it. And I have to do body work with them without being intrusive. I do rhythmic tapping, I do Reiki, I do cranial sacral therapy because it's not, they don't have to take their clothes off. They're very, I don't do a lot of touching. I do the work. But I'm vibrating, right? So Indigenous people know that vibration is part of healing. The land we live on has a vibration. When I talked earlier about how the fact is when I come back to Saskatchewan, this is where I'm from. I vibrate at the same level as the earth. I come back and I go, right? I'm home. I feel totally in my spirit when I'm here. In Alberta, it's a different story, and I've been there for 45 years. I'm still trying to get the vibration, right? So vibration is everything to Indigenous kids. And everything is emotional to them. What do I feel? What do I see? What do I hear? What do I taste? So when you're working with kids who have FASD, who are coming from trauma, that's how you heal them, is through the emotional senses. And then the other things. But kids can't concentrate until you get them into a resting brain and get them down here. Then they'll hear you, but they won't hear you before that. So it's, I was going to do a little exercise with you. Maybe I'll do it on another day before when we start, about how your body and your mind are connected. I didn't get through too many slides, but that's okay. I'll stop there because lunch is there. Are there any questions? Yes.
I just had one. Like, if you're giving presentations to some people that maybe don't identify as Indigenous, like, how can you help people to bring them down to your spirit? Like, for me, like, if I was to bring Sweetgrass to stage, as much as I absolutely love this imaging, I feel like it wouldn't be coming from me because it's not the way I was raised. So I would want something to be more like genuine coming from me, but I don't know how to do that without my Indigenous roots.
Right. Well, I get that question all the time. We have to do something to get people down into their spirit, right? Mm-hmm. So if they're not Indigenous and don't identify that, but there's a lot of people that don't identify as Indigenous, and you know they are. They're coming from that. Because I also get Child and Family Services who say to me, this child was adopted out, they don't want to have anything to do with their culture. And I say, don't tell me that. Because they have a right to be part of their culture. And then let them decide, not you, right? So what I do when people come into my office and say, oh, I'm Indigenous, but I'm Catholic. I go, oh, that's okay. Can I start this way, please? Because I need to come into my spirit. And they go, yeah, that's okay. And so what happens is I'm engaging them, and they feel safe then. And they're like, oh, right? And then the next time they come, they'll say, I see them do this, right? So you can do what you need to do, depending on who you're working with. I don't suggest that you do smudging if somebody's not Indigenous, right? What would you use, right? You have to figure out how to get them into a resting brain so that they come down into their spirit, however that might be, right? And then you can talk to them. You can't before that. Any other questions? Yes?
I just have more of a comment. I just wanted to say, I love, this is my second time seeing you, and I love that you put into words what sometimes I'm feeling. I was speaking with Dana earlier about going back to where my mother was from, her reserve, and I thought we were good, but you talking about vibration really speaks to me.
Because now you know why it feels good, right? Yeah, thank you, thank you. I try to put into the spiritual meaning of why we do things. Because what I found when I was growing up is people would say, well, smudge. And I'm like, what is that, right? So a lot of people who aren't Indigenous, they see people smudge and they're like, well, what is that, right? I try to talk about the spirit of why we're doing it. We feel it on a very deep level. We are connected to the earth, but we're all Indigenous people, right? So the science of epigenetics shows us that we carry the memories and the behaviors of our ancestors way, way back, right? Any other questions? Okay. Everybody take a deep breath, come into your belly buttons. Put our brain to a resting state so we can eat and come back together. So thank you.
Thank you, Kerrie.